Welcome everyone to this Friday morning's Huessy seminar. We offer 2 to 3 of these deterrence seminars every month, usually at 10 a.m. Eastern. My name is Alex Littlefield. I'm Chief of Staff and Fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS for short. Our host is NIDS Senior Fellow Peter Huessy. He's been hosting these events for 40 years now, and they were always in person. Only more recently have they moved over to virtual. NIDS is a 501c3 think tank. Our motto is Think Deterrence. We focus on this one theme, deterrence. Deterrence is another way of saying peace through strength, and we promote this perspective through our weekly podcasts, the NIDS View and NIDS Knowledge, our journal Global Security Review, our NIDS Academy, and in-person and virtual events. Before Peter introduces today's speaker, you're encouraged to direct message me in the chat, and I can give you the mic and camera so that you may speak directly to our speaker today. Also, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat, or there's a Q&A box as well. Now, today we're very pleased to have Brad Roberts with us, and he's in California, so I appreciate that he got up extra early for all of us today. And he'll be talking about Towards Deterrence Strategy 3.0. And now over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome, Dr. Brad Roberts, for making the time out of your day to come and talk to us. Brad has served as the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore since 2015. Prior to that, for 4 years, between 2009 and 2013, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy and served as Policy Director of the Obama administration's Nuclear Posture Review and Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and led their implementation. Now, prior to entering government service, Dr. Roberts was a research fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis and the Center for Strategic International Studies, editor of the Washington Quarterly, and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. And between leaving the Office of Secretary of Defense in 2013 and assuming his current responsibilities, Dr. Roberts was a consulting professor at Stanford University, and he was a fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. He authored a book entitled The Case for Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, which won the Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title in 2016. He has a doctorate in international relations. He has a master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a bachelor's degree in international security from Stanford University. For those who are interested and go to his website, I would highly recommend 3 books or 3 writings of Dr. Roberts. One is his just released The Next Chapter in U.S. Nuclear Policy, the Washington Quarterly, in July of this year. And the one that was particularly interesting on Theories of Victory, Red and Blue, which is a Lawrence Livermore paper on global security in June of 2020. And the aforementioned The Case for Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century, a Stanford University Press publication in 2015. Dr. Roberts specializes in writing about things that, as he says, are outside our comfort zone. And as he said earlier to us, he's holding the mirror up to the world, which indeed he is. And before, Brad, you begin, I would like to say hello to 3 of our good friends who have also been speakers here, Frank Miller, Dr. Stephen Blank, and Rob Sufer. So, Brad, please, over to you. And on behalf of NIDS, welcome and thank you very much for taking part in our series.
Well, Peter, thank you for the kind invitation, the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this regular event. And welcome everyone. And I am proof that in California, things do happen even at 7 o'clock in the morning. My topic is, as you know, Deterrence Strategy 3.0. My views that I'm going to express are my personal views. I'm not speaking on behalf of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or any of its sponsors. And I know I'm speaking to a well-informed and thoughtful group. So I'm going to try and hit some high points and then leave plenty of time for discussion because we're all trying to make sense of the world that's unfolding in front of us. 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. 1.0, a shorthand to describe deterrence strategy as it was practiced in the Cold War. one principal foe, a bipolar world, the nuclear standoff, the balance of conventional and nuclear deterrence, and a certain view of strategic stability arising from the experiences in the early Cold War related to crisis instability and then arms race instability. Then, of course, in a matter of a short and remarkable few years, the Cold War ended. And as the Soviet flag was coming down over Moscow, Saddam Hussein was invading Kuwait. And immediately we entered into Deterrence Strategy 2.0, or a new phase in which a new strategy took shape. And this was a deterrence strategy that didn't take Russia or any major power as its principal focus. It took rogue states as its principal focus. And in major power relations, we put our focus on not deterrence, but strategic stability. And this is a remarkably common theme across the Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama administrations. We shifted away from a strategy based on mutual assured destruction or mutual vulnerability because no president wants to accept a relationship of mutual vulnerability with North Korea or Iran or a similar regional actor. And thus, the vision of the needed deterrent began to take on significant non-nuclear components in addition to a conventional overmatch capability. And then with a less clear defining point, we entered a new phase. You might say it was 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, the revelation that Moscow was willing to use force to change international borders, Ash Carter's call for a new playbook, quote unquote. I dated a little earlier than that, the defense strategy refresh of 2012 included a short and cryptic reference to 21st century contingencies, defined as contingencies in which states, to escape failed acts of regional conventional aggression, had to escalate to nuclear weapons to try to survive. And of course, each new administration has given its imprimatur to the evolving deterrence strategy since then, from the Obama administration's third offset to integrated deterrence. And I'm struck by how leisurely has been our march through the new issues that are in front of us. But they've come piece by piece in front of us, and I want to identify 6 challenges that have emerged in their each in their own timeline in the period since roughly 2014. The first and most obvious challenge is the shift from cooperative relations with Russia and China to adversarial ones. People still use the words rivalry and competition, but it's obviously become something more and worse than that. It's confrontation and forms of ongoing conflict. There's also the dimension of the Russia-China friendship without limits, and the rising concern about a more global axis of opposition or of resistance. No one's given it a clear name yet, but cooperation among 4 leaders, each of whom consider themselves to be men of destiny. Leaders who are not likely to leave to their successors the business of finishing the agendas they've set out on, and who believe that they are in an historic moment to make a huge impact on the flow of 21st century history. And the deterrence, one feature of the deterrence problem that results from this more adversarial relationship with these leaders is what I would shorthand as the Tocqueville trap. Alexis de Tocqueville came to America 200 years ago, wrote an elaborate and lengthy manuscript of hundreds of numbered paragraphs. And I think it's the case that only 6 of those paragraphs relate to the impact of democracy on the foreign relations of the United States. But his basic argument is that what on this topic was that the things that are a virtue from the perspective of the things about democracy that are a virtue from the perspective of the domestic affairs of the people are not necessarily virtues from the perspective of their foreign affairs. He emphasized what we would call the short attention span of democracies, but he talked about the desire to deconcentrate power, to weaken central authority, and one of his arguments was that we're serious about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and choose to ignore the hard problems of the world until almost too late. But the deterrence problem he points to is that authoritarian rivals don't understand this about democracies, that we're slow to rouse, but once roused, we're willing to use extravagant force to expunge a hated evil, to quote Herman Kahn. And for them, killing isn't personal, it's just professional. And thus they're surprised by the behavior of democracies when it comes to war making. And I'm very much concerned that in the current moment, we face a set of leaders who have calculated that democracies are weak, easily divided, led by weak people, and that they've judged that they can press our interests without significant risk. So the first big challenge to deterrence strategy in the 3.0 phase is to adapt to this more adversarial quality of relations with Russia and China. The second big challenge, which we'd be talking a lot more about if we didn't have adversarial relations with Russia and China, is the failure of non-proliferation in North Korea and prospectively in Iran. We can't just say we live in a world of 2 nuclear armed peers and think that we've finished the discussion of deterrence. The fact that we have a nuclear arming North Korea and an Iran at the brink means that we live in a more multipolar nuclear world. And it's a world marked by potential nuclear tipping points. We just convened a workshop here at CGSR in May on the nuclear future of the Middle East. And the whole discussion was about the extent to which an Iranian decision to cross the nuclear threshold would be a catalyst to much broader nuclear proliferation in the region. And then, of course, there's the debate about whether that would be isolated to that region if the tipping point brought the collapse of the NPT, then we would expect proliferation elsewhere. So the failure of the non-proliferation regime is becoming increasingly significant from the perspective of U.S. deterrence strategy. And of course, there's a separate discussion about the medium term and near term viability of that regime. A third challenge, emerging and disruptive technologies. We've all talked about this. We've all thought about this, read about this. The competitive aspect is in the military application of these technologies. And we're of course concerned about the instabilities that come with competition in this area, and the fact that in the new domains, cyberspace and outer space in particular, the incentive to go first, early and hard is very strong, because these are tools that aren't going to last very long in a significant conflict. And if you feel that you're in a use it or lose it situation, well, we all know the consequences of that. The fourth challenge, rising anxiety among U.S. allies. U.S. allies are always anxious. That's not new. U.S. allies were anxious in the 1990s about the rogue state proliferation problem, but their anxiety has spread from what might have been considered in the 1990s the frontline states, a handful of states with troublesome neighbors, to our general alliance structure, which we have allies who live in the nuclear crosshairs of their major power neighbors, or perhaps of North Korea or Iran. And they worry about the wisdom of the bet they have placed on a strong relationship with the United States. And they recognize that the developments in American politics since the end of the Cold War over the last 2 decades are likely to be enduring features of our political life, not something associated with any single individual. And they fret. They have a pit in their stomach. And we safeguard these alliances in the nuclear deterrence domain with a nuclear posture designed in 1991, when a posture for extended deterrence built on the premise that extended deterrence can be done essentially with our strategic systems. In 1991, we brought home, as you all know, thousands of nuclear weapons that had been deployed abroad in support of our alliances, and dismantled and destroyed most of them, and certainly eliminated the tactical weapons. And we kept, as you will know, a small number of nuclear-armed cruise missiles for the purpose of being able to, quote, re-extend deterrence. This was the version as it was understood by our allies in Northeast Asia, extended nuclear deterrence in time of crisis by redeploying those weapons. Well, as you all know, those were retired in 2010. And we are trying to prop up a global system of extended nuclear deterrence on a posture designed for an era that was at the end of 1.0 and in the transition to 2.0. Fifth challenge is the defection of Russia and China from the old strategy for stability. What do I mean by this? Our strategy for stability in 1.0 was to dialogue with Soviet counterparts about the nuclear relationship between our two countries and two alliance systems, in search of areas of common interest, which we thought we could find and maybe did find to an extent on strategic stability. And then we collaboratively defined confidence and security building measures. And on top of the confidence that generated, we built arms control agreements. And this process in toto produced what we believe to be a stable strategic situation and the political context in which it was possible to, over time, transform the relationship. A pretty compelling story. In 2.0, we tried to reconceive strategic stability without reconceiving it very much. We tried to put it in a different context of relationships with Russia and China that were not adversarial, but needed to be stable. But we have found in 3.0, we're continuing to pursue our 1.0 strategy. In my shorthand, jabber, jabber, jabber. Talk until we can find some area of common interest with Russia and China. But of course, the leaders of Russia and China are having nothing of it. And this experience best came home to me in a brief interaction, a brief story I'll share about. On my watch, we shifted the missile defense strategy in Europe from the third site to European phased adaptive. And a part of the European phased adaptive approach was missile defense, confidence, and security building measures with Russia in Europe. And I was a part of the team that spent a year and a half trying to persuade Russia of the virtues of CBMs in Europe on BMD. Over the course of that year and a half, they rejected every single proposal we made, and then their own. Literally, they withdrew proposals that they had made, including for the JDEC Center in Moscow, without explanation. And a few years later, I bumped into a former Russian diplomat who'd been involved in that process at a venue where I thought he might be a little freer to talk. And so I asked him why. Why did you reject confidence and security building measures with the United States on missile defense in Europe? Quote, you Americans already have too much of both, meaning confidence and security. And if that's your central leadership view of strategic stability, that a stable America, or an America that perceives itself in a stable and secure situation, is a dangerous America, then you don't participate with America in designing confidence and security building measures to build American security. And Russia and China have been very clear that they are concerned about crisis and arms race instabilities, but they don't see any benefit in cooperating with an America that is destined to do them harm in their view. So this leaves us in the situation where we have to find new partners for strategic stability to the extent we can, and those would be our allies, and different solutions from the ones we pursued, because our interest in strategic stability doesn't go away just because Russia and China don't want to partner with us in trying to promote it. And a sixth and final challenge is the one that's emerged most recently in the debates about, in the report of the Strategic Posture Commission principally, but also the new National Defense Strategy Commission report. The mismatch between our commitments, which are truly global and include the extension of nuclear deterrence into 3 regions, and our willingness to invest resources in support of those commitments, both fiscal and political. And this goes to the heart of our long-term deterrence strategy. So I've outlined 6 challenges to deterrence in the new, different, complex, and dangerous security environment in which we now are living. And Peter referenced my closing thought in the Washington Quarterly article to which he referenced, which was the main argument in that article is that we've passed out of one era and we've entered another. The era that we've passed out of began with the end of the Cold War, and in the 1990s, many things became possible in nuclear policy that we had long sought. To reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons, to stop the arms race, to build an arms control regime, a comprehensive one, to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime, etc. You all know the story. Now we've passed through a period in which the changes to the international order have been as fundamental as the changes associated with the end of the Cold War. And they have equally wide-ranging implications for our nuclear strategy and posture. But unlike the 1990s, when we found it possible to do many things we wanted to do, today we're called upon to do many things we don't want to do. We don't want, as a nation, as a body politic, to increase the number of nuclear weapons, to walk away from arms control, I mean, you know the list. And we're moving into a situation where we're going to have to make national decisions and decisions with our allies that will be unpopular and criticized by many traditional camps. But this is the world we live in, and it calls for more leadership on nuclear policy and nuclear deterrence strategy from a high political level than we've seen in a while. So Peter, with that, let me hope I've put enough on the table for a rich discussion. Let me turn it back to you and take the discussion wherever anyone would like.
Boy, Brad, thank you very much. That was an extraordinary kind of a view from 40,000 feet. As I told you in an email earlier this week, I would like to ask you the following, and that is, of all the work you do at your center, which you share with the world, and there are a lot of seminars you do online and so forth, what insights have you developed at the center from your studies that would help us deal with the challenge of nuclear deterrence 3.0?
Well, my short answer is that there's no short answer, because we've tried to break the problem down into its relevant parts, and the work of the center is spread over 5 main topical areas. The first is major power rivalry and deterrence. How do Russia and China think about war with the United States or conflict with the United States? The second is new regional challenges and challengers. How do North Korea and Iran think about conflict with the United States? The third is towards deterrence strategy 3.0, the ground we've just covered. And the fourth and fifth are the future of long-term competitive strategies and the future of long-term cooperative strategies. And to see the nuclear problem whole, you need all of those pieces to some extent. Now we've prioritized a few problems that we didn't see people working on. As you know, Peter, we prioritized work on the 2 nuclear peer problem and produced a study group report a year and a half ago. Work on a follow-on study on the counterforce debate. My impression was that the debate about counterforce was largely trapped in a Cold War framework, and it was time to lift it into the 21st century context. So we'll have a publication on that as soon as the clearance gods in the Pentagon give us permission to do so. And we're updating that theory of victory work. The theory of victory work was a product of the period from 2010 to 2020, roughly. And I think we have evidence that Russia and China are evolving their thinking about the nature of conflict with the United States, and so there's new work to be done there.
Let me go back, if I can, Brad, to something that you raised years ago, which was you and General Hyten, and that was this idea of escalate to win, or some people put it escalate to de-escalate. The idea was threaten to escalate with nuclear weapons from a conventional conflict, which would get the adversary, the United States, to stand down and no longer continue the fight.
Mm-hmm.
Where's your thinking on that? And I reference a recent discussion by, I believe, Mr. Jim Service from England, written 17 books about Russia. And he didn't say that Putin's threats are bluff, but he said Putin understands any nuclear exchange could get out of hand, and that any even limited exchanges would be a disaster. So he kind of indicated he thought deterrence will hold. What's your thinking of the work you've done in the center? You raised this issue, got almost 10 years ago, as to what extent are the Russian and even Chinese threats to escalate to the nuclear level? Where are we with respect to that threat?
Well, with the Chinese, we have really no basis for judging. We understand that their declaratory policy is an unreliable indicator of their likely practice in war. We can infer some things from the forces they're developing, but we don't know very much. And it's another area where they don't want to talk to us about that because they don't want us to know very much. On Russia, it's important to, I mean, my starting point on Russia, of course, I don't know what Putin thinks either. And I'm not sure that Putin knows what Putin would think in time of crisis. But Russian military strategy distinguishes three levels of war: local, regional, and what we would call world war. And I believe the logic of mutual assured destruction remains embedded in their thinking about the World War scenario. But the troublesome developments are at the regional level of war, where they imagine the possibility of using their new strategic weapon set, quote unquote, which includes non-strategic nuclear weapons, the new strategic weapon set, to, quote, sober, but not enrage NATO. And what do they mean by that? They mean to awaken NATO publics to the asymmetry of stake underpinning the issue and dispute between Russia and NATO, which they believe, the Russian expert community believes, that in any conflict on the Russian periphery, Russian interests are going to be more compelling than those of their adversary. And awakened to this asymmetry of stake, we will discover that we don't have a dog in the fight and should back down. And so in that context, a nuclear war can be won because it can be kept limited. Now, does Putin think that way? I don't know. He clearly believes that there's a coercive value in looking like he believes that. I wouldn't call the man a bluffer, but I think he's made excessive use of nuclear threats to try to coerce us, and has lost. They've lost some coercive potential the more frequent they become.
Thank you, Brad, very much for that. I would like to invite our guests to use the chat function to write questions. Alex can unmute your mic if you would like to talk directly to Brad. I would encourage you to do that as well. Brad, one of the recent reports you referenced was the October 2023 Posture Commission. We've heard from Madeline Creedon, and we've heard from Matthew Kronig, who have talked about, and Rose Gottmiller. And I was wondering, given the recommendations of the Posture Commission, which numbered close, I think, to 100, would you give me kind of a preview of what recommendations you would place as a priority for Congress to consider and make their decision one way or the other, or the administration, or both, because both have to be in on the deal? So would you give us a kind of a preview of where you think the Posture Commission, what are some of the highlights you would think should be priorities for the U.S. to adopt?
Well, I think the first is where the Posture Commission begins, which is you cannot have a sound nuclear strategy in the absence of a sound defense strategy, a sound defense strategy that aligns with the commitments we've made. And we're under-resourced for the strategy we've embraced as a nation. So I begin there. Then I think then my thinking goes next to the NDS Commission and their report of 2 weeks ago, and their argument that the Department of Defense has missed opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to reorient itself to the emerging security environment. And thus, this time, their report focuses on why that has been so. What has been so challenging for the adaptation of defense strategy, policy, and posture to this new security environment. And the report holds up a mirror to the Congress and to the department. And I think the general problem of accelerating adaptation so that we adapt at the speed of relevance, our overall military strategy, is as important to the solution of the nuclear problem as anything else. Then third, I would say fit for purpose. The Posture Commission talks about the strategic posture of the United States being fit for purpose currently, but destined to become less so over the coming decade, and the extended deterrent posture not being fit for purpose and becoming even less fit over the coming decade. The decade ahead is going to be very challenging. If my reading of Putin, Xi, and Kim Jong-un is correct, that they think they're men of destiny. I think we need sound answers to what's required to be fit for purpose over this decade.
Okay, and thanks. And we have a question here from Rob Sufer.
Good morning, Brad.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Good morning, Brad.
Good morning, Rob. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, I just want to remind you that you're about a year away from the 10-year anniversary of your book, the publication of your book. So I hope you have plans to update it, to bring it into the 21st century. But one of the things that you mentioned in your book is you talk about the advantages or the benefits of missile defense. And you list a menu of about, I think, 15 items. Some are related to theater missile defense, some are related to homeland missile defense. So with respect to the latter, homeland defense, how do you see U.S. homeland missile defenses as meeting some of these challenges of Deterrence 3.0? And as you know, the Strategic Posture Commission has sort of shed a light on Russian limited coercive threats, Russian and Chinese coercive threats against the homeland. And you know also that in the two nuclear peer environment, the survivability and endurability of U.S. nuclear forces against two nuclear peers becomes even more important. So how is your thinking on this starting to evolve?
Well, thank you for reminding me of the homework that's in front of me on a second edition of the book, or just a different book. The book was recently translated into Japanese, and at that time I had to do a new closing chapter, and of course a lot has unfolded over the last decade. But that's an undertaking for another time. In shorthand, Rob, my thinking goes to this 2.0, 3.0 distinction. 2.0, missile defense had a set of clear roles in terms of deterrence of rogue states and regional aggression by any power, major or minor. But we believed we could stay ahead of the rogue state threat without jeopardizing strategic stability with Russia and China. In 3.0, we face new threats from major power rivals who may be developing strike capabilities for the purpose of managing the transition from what Russia calls regional war to world war. Who may believe that in the opening salvos of a great power conflict, they can seize a decisive advantage by stripping away our command and control and national leadership assets. For that problem, I would like to have a missile defense component. That's essentially the coercive threat that the commission was talking about. I'm not persuaded by the logic of staying ahead of rogue state threats. That was the right logic when North Korea had 5 or 20 or 30 ICBMs and nuclear weapons, but when it's got 150 or 300, staying ahead means composing a defense that's much more capable than the one we have, and I'm not sure of the viability of that, and I'm not sure of the impact on strategic stability as we traditionally conceive it. So that's sort of new terrain to think through from my perspective. That's a short answer to your good question, Rob. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brad. I take a different view than you on that latter point, but perhaps we can talk about that offline. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brad, we have a question from one of our longtime listeners, Chris. Let me read you his question. He says, how do you best maintain fit for purpose extended deterrence with allies in NATO or the Middle East or Asia? And how restrained should nuclear proliferation among our allies in all three regions be kept?
So this is another topic that we have an inherited logic from 1.0 and 2.0. This is in reference to the second question about how much proliferation restraint do we ask of our allies, and to what extent do we benefit from second centers of decision in deterrence, and why do we say we want second centers of decision in Europe, but we don't want them in Northeast Asia? My sense of the context here is that in 3.0, we need a new division of deterrence labor with and among our allies. That the historic division, which essentially placed conventional deterrence in the hands of our allies and nuclear deterrence in the hands of the United States, it just doesn't fit the complexity of the environment that we've moved into. And our alliances in Northeast Asia have begun to talk very clearly about the role of the alliances as opposed to allies in deterrence, and a division of labor shifting increasingly to those Northeast Asian allies in the strategic conventional domain, so strike and missile defense. And we need to ask more. In a two-peer world where we have to worry about simultaneous conflicts in both Europe and Asia, we need to ask more of our allies on extended deterrence, and we need to enhance our capacity to manage two crises simultaneously. That's not the same as saying to engage in extended nuclear war fighting in two theaters. But any mounting regional conflict with any of our prospective adversaries today is going to have a nuclear dimension. They are going to cast a nuclear shadow. And if we're incapable of doing so or inept in doing so, this will shape the conflict in fundamental ways, particularly for our allies. But Peter, I've lost the thread on the first question. Could you repeat the first question?
That's a good question. I think it had to do with, let me go back to it, but let me ask you a question from Al Moroni. He makes a point that the CNAS did a study saying that we may very well have to bring nuclear forces to our allies in Northeast Asia. And that he calls it nuclear conventional integration. Are we ready for that? And it's an interesting question. As you know, both in Korea, especially less so in Japan, there is real, at least in the popular polls and in some of the discussion, should they have their own nuclear deterrent, or should the United States bring its deterrent and regional deterrent to the country involved?
Well, this goes back to that first question, Peter, actually, about how to extend nuclear deterrence and what are the problems. We extend deterrence to our allies with both hardware and software. And by software, I mean diplomacy, declaratory policy, consultative processes, and both the hardware and the software have needed attention in recent years. And beginning really in the George W. Bush administration, efforts have been made to strengthen cooperation with allies in support of extended deterrence commitments. We accelerated those in the Obama administration, and each new administration has continued to support the strengthening of extended nuclear deterrence. And I would argue that much of the right policy and declaratory policy is in place in both Europe and Asia. I think it's murkier to our partners in the Middle East, but we lack the capabilities sufficient in number to do the kind of signaling in crisis and in an early phases of an open conflict that we would need to be able to do in a two-peer context. So that raises the question of what more can we do with the hardware side in Northeast Asia? And one option, the most severe option, is to the most severe option is for our allies to acquire nuclear weapons of their own. This would spell the end of the non-proliferation regime, and this would generate a very significant feedback from China and Russia. And it would create a much larger loose nukes problem. So I don't think it's in America's interest or in our allies' interest to see that happen. When I talk with South Koreans about the wisdom of that pathway, I remind them of something that the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament said in 2006. Interviewed by a BBC reporter, the Speaker was asked, "Does Iran want nuclear weapons?" And he said, of course we do. Look at the environment we live in, look at our relationship with the great Satan, and we would love to be the second and last country in the Middle East to have nuclear weapons, but that's not the real choice, he said, because we wouldn't be the last. Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition would stimulate many others to get them. So the real choice is between continuing to move in the direction of getting them or life in a nuclear armed jungle. That's the real choice in Asia as well. So I'm not an advocate of independent nuclear capabilities for South Korea or Japan in the current context. If the United States were choose to abandon these alliances for some reason, then it would be in our interest for them to acquire nuclear weapons. But I think the solution lies in a more ready and credible posture for deploying nuclear weapons into the theater in time of crisis. And this has been our policy since 2010 and earlier. But we've not demonstrated much of a capability or much of an interest in making good on the policy, something our allies have taken note of. And I would like to see steps to develop, to put in place modern weapons storage facilities and exercises for the crisis and wartime deployment of weapons into the theater. This would have a deterrence effect and an assurance benefit.
And Amanda Hart from DITRA, Brad, has a question which you just answered a little bit, but I'm going to read you her question. She says, given that you have experienced and agree that there is little interest in peace and security engagements between the US, Russia, and China, where do you see nuclear state interactions and relations going in the next 10 to 30 years? But here's the guts of her question. What can the United States do to maintain global stability, reassure our allies, and protect our homeland, especially in light of this point that China and Russia are not much for dialogue right now? You've answered that in part, but are there other things you would add to that? For example, development of the nuclear armed cruise missile for the Navy. But as Rose Gottmiller told us, that is what, a decade away or 7 years away. Is there something we could do more in the interim, more rapidly?
Well, to the macro level question about what can we do to maintain global strategic stability, one is to lower our expectations and aspirations. We're not going to live in a stable strategic environment for as long as these men are in charge in these capitals. And we need to be adept at managing instability. And we need to be confident and convey our confidence in our ability to defend ourselves and our allies. So the question was, how do we protect strategic stability, defend the homeland, and secure our allies? I would put it slightly differently. We safeguard strategic stability to the extent we can by protecting the homeland and safeguarding our allies, making them secure. The worst thing we could do is walk away from our alliances. The worst thing we could do from the perspective of strategic stability is to walk away from our alliances. And I think it's urgent that, I mean, as you know, the Posture Commission uses the word urgent 40 or more times.
Yes.
And that aligns with my own thinking. It's urgent that we do some things to buttress our nuclear and conventional deterrence strategies. I care less about the what than the fact of doing something. I mean, we can dispute whether this system is the right system or that system's the right system, or 7 years payoff versus 10 years payoff. But if my Tocqueville trap is correct, if that analogy makes sense, we need to address the misjudgment that has already taken shape in the minds of our adversarial leaders about our strategic intent. And in game theory, the way you do that is by engaging in costly actions. The challenge an opponent's understanding of your resolve. And one of the principal benefits of signing up to SLCM is that to do so requires overcoming a lot of political objection and putting a lot of money on the table. This is a signal that yes, this is hard for us to do, but we feel strongly enough about this to do it. And I think we should be looking for a few costly signals. One of the most important is for NATO capitals to speak more clearly about the value of nuclear deterrence today. Most NATO capitals leave it to Brussels, to NATO headquarters, to the NATO international staff to talk about the value to the alliance of nuclear weapons. And that reluctance to talk leads just a wide open field for disinformation coming from Moscow and Iran and Beijing. So that's an example of a costly signal on the software side that I think would pay dividends for us.
Let me ask you a question having to do with Phil Zelikow wrote an essay recently, was 15,000 words, I believe, and he said, even if we modernize under the current schedule, both conventional, nuclear, space, it may be so many years down the road, another decade, that we will not be prepared for conflicts we will have to engage in the interim. So he didn't say I'm against the modernization, but he said he was against the extent of it. And Steve Blank and I wrote an essay that you may have seen about a week ago, in which we said, yes, we may do a lot of this stuff after the bad guys do some terrible things, and we're not going to be as prepared as we otherwise would be. But whatever happens over the next decade, we need to continue the modernization effort, in fact, enhance it. I don't know if you read Phil's essay, but how do you address this question of we're going to modernize, but it's going to be perhaps after the bad guys decide to do bad things?
Well, I agree that the Zelikov essay is long. I agree that it's a worthy read. I borrowed the phrase "men of destiny" from Zelikov's essay. For those who haven't read it, it's a look at the emerging axis and what to make of it. To what extent it is an axis, and there's a very thoughtful comment on the Zelikov essay by Lawrence Friedman, who tries to take a more reassuring view. But on the timeline mismatch, first of all, while there's been an erosion of deterrence over the last decade, I don't think that the military judgment of people in either Moscow or Beijing is that they could go to war against the United States and its alliances and expect to win. They could expect a mess. They could expect to safeguard some of their interests, but clear all-out victory, I don't believe that they think they have in place the capabilities they need to do that. So our deterrence posture has eroded, but it hasn't collapsed. And if we are putting in place, well, we have in place elements of a stronger posture that will emerge, but there's more we need to do over the coming decade. But if their judgment is the window of opportunity isn't open now, and it's going to close further, I mean, to stretch the analogy, close further in the years ahead, then we're just not going to come to a day in which they conclude that this is a good day to go to war against America. Now, this is the optimistic case. The pessimist case is that Tocqueville's right. These guys are capable of a gross miscalculation of our interests and our response to an insult to our interests. And they're not really interested in the balance of forces, as was the case in 1939, 40, 41. The German general staff calculated probably correctly that the French were in a superior military. And Hitler said, I don't care, they're not going to defend their interests effectively, let's go. And he turned out to be right. So, I mean, I think the problem Zelikov points to is real, but I think it's more complicated.
Thank you, Brad. Brad, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Littlefield, our Chief of Staff, to tell us about next week's seminar and anything else you would like to. But on behalf of it, you did an extraordinary job, as usual. It's very sobering and enlightening. And we will have a transcript of your remarks at some point in another couple days when Alex gets to it and finishes it. But again, on behalf of NIDS, thank you for an extraordinary presentation and some really very strong insights as to the problems facing this country. And again, I thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity. And thank you for NIDS and what you guys do to advance our national dialogue on these things.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And to the audience, thank you for all those questions. And sorry that there are still some people who weren't able to get around to asking a question. But we always try to start in within the 1 hour time frame. Next week, we have another seminar. This is with Curtis McGiffin and Andrew Lawler, and it's their report that came out, Dynamic Parity, a Nuclear Strategy for the Next Generation. That'll be at 10 a.m. Eastern, and we hope that you can all be here. And we are grateful for those of us who are going to do what we can to try and keep this country and keep this world safe and peaceful for as long as possible. Thank you, Brad, for your work that you're doing at Lawrence Livermore, and wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.